I've gone back and forth about posting this for years, mostly because once you write something down it stops being a bad memory and starts being a fact. But this sub has a way of pulling honesty out of people, so here goes. My name's William, and this is one of the smaller crimes I committed, at least on paper, but it's the one that still crawls up my spine when I think about it. This happened when I was in my mid-20s, broke, angry, and convinced the world owed me something it had forgotten to deliver. I lived in a sleepy neighborhood where everyone pretended not to notice everyone else. Lawns trimmed, porch lights on timers, polite nods and nothing more. I noticed things anyway: who left early, who came home late, whose routines never changed. That's where the idea came from, if I'm being honest. I wasn't desperate in the starving sense. I was desperate in the way that comes from entitlement and boredom mixing into something ugly. The neighbor's house seemed like easy prey. Quiet, predictable, empty at the right times. I told myself it wasn't personal. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone. I told myself a lot of things back then. What I didn't expect was that the night I chose would end up being the one that cracked something open in me: fear, guilt, whatever you want to call it, and showed me how thin the line was between just this once and becoming someone I didn't recognize anymore. I never called it planning back then. Planning would have implied I knew what I was doing, or at least that I accepted what I was about to do. In my head, it was more like thinking ahead, which felt harmless enough to sleep at night. I paid attention during my normal routines, taking out the trash, pretending to check my phone while actually watching porch lights and garage doors. The neighbor in question had patterns you could set a watch by, and I told myself noticing them was just being observant, not predatory. I didn't draw maps or make lists like in the movies. It was all mental notes, rehearsed in my head while lying awake at night. What time the street went quiet. Which windows stayed dark. How long the silence lasted before a car passed. I wore clothes I already owned, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make me feel like a criminal, because I didn't want to feel like one yet. That was important to me, maintaining the illusion that I was still basically a decent guy making a bad call. I remember checking my own pulse before I left my place that night. Not racing, not calm either, somewhere in between, like my body knew what my mind was trying not to admit. I locked my door behind me, which is a small detail, but it stuck with me. There was something twisted about securing my own space while preparing to violate someone else's. Even then, a quiet part of me knew that once I stepped off my porch, whatever happened next would be something I'd be carrying for a long time. The walkover felt longer than it should have. Same sidewalk I'd used 100 times, same cracked concrete slab near the mailbox, same stupid wind chime 2 houses down that never shut up. But every step carried weight now. I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that nothing looked different, even though I was about to do something that would have horrified the version of me from a few years earlier. I waited longer than necessary, standing in the shadow of a tree, listening. No TVs humming, no footsteps, no voices drifting through open windows. Just the low hiss of distant traffic and my own breathing, suddenly way too loud in my ears. My brain kept offering me exits. You can still go home. No one would know. At the same time, another voice kept pushing back. You've already come this far. When I finally moved, it wasn't dramatic. No adrenaline-fueled sprint, no cinematic music cue. Just a slow, deliberate motion toward the side of the house, my heart thudding harder with every inch. The moment my hand touched the exterior wall, something shifted. That was the point of no return. Up until then, it had all been theoretical. Touching that house made it real. I remember pausing, palm flat against the cool surface, feeling like the house itself was aware of me. It's strange how your mind humanizes things when you're doing something wrong. I wasn't thinking about what I'd take yet. I wasn't even thinking about getting caught. All I could focus on was the fact that I was standing somewhere I absolutely did not belong, and that I was choosing to stay. I won't get into the specifics of how I got in. Not because I'm trying to be mysterious, but because that part has blurred over time, like my brain decided it didn't deserve a replay. What I do remember clearly is the moment the inside air hit me, stale, slightly warm, smelling faintly of detergent and something sweet, maybe a candle burned down too far. The door clicked shut behind me with a sound that felt impossibly loud. I froze, every muscle locked, convinced the whole block had heard it. Nothing happened. No lights flipped on. No shouting. Just silence swallowing me whole. That silence was heavier indoors, pressing in from all sides, making every tiny movement feel amplified. I stood there longer than I should have, just listening, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dark. The house felt lived in a way I hadn't expected. Shoes by the door. A jacket slung over a chair. Little signs of routine and comfort that made my chest tighten in an uncomfortable way. This wasn't an empty target anymore. It was someone's life, laid out casually, trusting that no one like me would wander in. My hands were shaking, which surprised me. I'd imagined myself calm, focused, efficient. Instead, I felt like a kid who'd snuck into a place he knew he'd be punished for entering. Every step forward was careful, almost apologetic. I kept telling myself to hurry, to get what I came for and leave, but part of me was stuck in this surreal disbelief. I'm actually doing this. I'm really here. Once I forced myself to move, everything became strangely methodical. Not skilled, just cautious in the way someone is when they're afraid of their own shadow. I kept to the edges of rooms, avoiding the center like the floor might betray me. The darkness played tricks on my depth perception, and more than once I flinched at my own reflection in a framed photo or a darkened window. What unsettled me most was how normal everything looked. A half-read book on the coffee table. A mug with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. Bills stacked neatly by a counter, waiting to be dealt with. These weren't props. They were evidence of a person who had plans for tomorrow. I felt like an intruder not just in a house, but in a timeline that wasn't mine. I kept thinking about why I was there, trying to stay focused on the goal I'd used to justify all of this. But the longer I stayed, the harder it became to see the place as a collection of valuables instead of a story I was interrupting. My heart was still racing, but now there was something else mixed in, an uneasy awareness that I'd crossed a moral boundary that couldn't be uncrossed, no matter how quietly I left. Every sound made me tense. The soft hum of an appliance kicking on. The building settling. Even my own breath felt intrusive. I realized then that getting in hadn't been the hardest part. The hardest part was being alone with myself inside that space, with nothing to distract me from the fact that I didn't belong, and that I knew it. I was in the middle of convincing myself to wrap it up when something shifted upstairs. Not a clear sound at first, more like a suggestion of movement, the kind your brain tries to explain away because the alternative is unbearable. I stood perfectly still, counting my breaths, listening hard enough that my ears actually started to ring. Then it happened again. A floorboard creak, deliberate this time. Slow. Human. Every plan I thought I had evaporated instantly. My mouth went dry, and my body felt both too heavy and too light at the same time, like I might either collapse or bolt without warning. I remember thinking, no, you checked. You were sure. That was the lie unraveling, right there. My brain went into overdrive, throwing out useless options. Hide. Run. Explain. None of them felt real or workable. I wasn't a shadow anymore. I was a presence, an intrusion that could be discovered any second. The house suddenly felt much smaller, the walls closing in, the air thick and hard to breathe. What scared me most wasn't getting caught, it was the idea of being seen. Of having to look someone in the eye and exist as the version of myself I'd tried so hard not to acknowledge. Up until that moment, I could pretend this was just a bad choice. But hearing someone else move in that house forced me to confront a much worse possibility, that I'd turned myself into a threat, whether I meant to or not. I pressed myself against the wall, heart slamming so hard I was convinced it could give me away on its own. The sound upstairs continued, slow footsteps, a pause, then another step. Whoever it was wasn't rushing. That made it worse. Panic I could understand. Calm meant awareness. I started replaying every assumption I'd made leading up to that night, watching them collapse one by one. The house wasn't empty. The routine wasn't foolproof. And I wasn't nearly as invisible as I'd convinced myself I was. There was a strange clarity in that fear, like my brain had finally dropped all the justifications and excuses. This wasn't a game, or a lapse in judgment anymore. This was a living, breathing person above me, and I was in their space without consent. For a split second, I considered calling out, saying something vague, harmless, anything to explain my presence. The idea died as soon as it formed. There was no explanation that didn't end with handcuffs or worse. So I stayed silent, holding my breath, trying to make myself smaller, less real. The footsteps stopped. That pause stretched into something unbearable. I remember thinking that this was it, that whatever came next would define how this story ended. In that moment, stripped of bravado and denial, I felt a deep, almost childlike regret. Not just for being there, but for the choices that had slowly led me to this exact, terrifying stillness. The silence broke with a light clicking sound, soft, controlled. A lamp, maybe? A glow crept down the staircase, thin at first, then wider, spilling into the hallway like it was searching for me. I shrank back instinctively, my pulse roaring so loud I was sure it would give me away. I could see a shadow now. Not fully formed, just the outline of a person at the top of the stairs. They didn't say anything. They didn't rush. They just stood there, and somehow that restraint was more terrifying than panic would have been. It told me they were thinking, assessing, trying to understand why something felt wrong in their own home. My mind raced through lies I could tell if confronted, each one collapsing under its own weight before I could commit to it. I wasn't supposed to be here. There was no version of this where I came out looking human. I felt exposed in a way I never had before, like all the excuses I'd built over the years had evaporated, leaving just the truth of who I was in that moment. The light shifted, sweeping the wall near me but stopping just short of where I stood. I remember the smell of dust and paint, the way my fingers dug into my palms as if pain could anchor me. This was the consequence I'd refused to picture while planning, another person's fear colliding head-on with my selfishness. And in that narrow slice of time, I knew that whatever happened next, I'd already crossed a line I couldn't pretend away. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen in the dark, them standing in the light. Time stopped behaving normally. It stretched and warped until every second felt like a minute. I was waiting for a shout, a question, something definitive. Instead, there was just breathing. Mine, definitely. Theirs, I think. Then I heard it, a small, uncertain sound. Not fear exactly, more like confusion. Someone trying to make sense of a feeling before it fully became panic. That sound did something to me. It cut through the adrenaline and landed straight in my gut. This wasn't an abstract victim anymore. This was a person, probably replaying their day, wondering if they'd forgotten to lock something, wondering why their home suddenly felt wrong. I realized then that I had a choice, even if none of the options were good. Stay and risk a confrontation that could spiral in ways I couldn't control. Or leave, quietly, immediately, and live with whatever that meant. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest as I made that decision without really thinking it through. I moved back the way I'd come, slow and careful, every muscle screaming with tension. The light never found me. I don't know if that was luck, mercy, or just timing. All I knew was that as I slipped away, something inside me was cracking, not relief exactly, but the heavy realization that I just narrowly avoided becoming the kind of story people tell with shaking hands. Getting out felt harder than getting in, even though I was retracing the same path. My body didn't trust itself anymore. Every movement felt clumsy, exaggerated, like I was suddenly too big for the space. I kept expecting a voice behind me, a light snapping on, a question I couldn't answer. None came. When I finally crossed the threshold back into the night air, it hit me how hard I was shaking. Not just my hands, my whole body. The cool air felt sharp in my lungs, grounding in a way the house never had. I didn't run. I wanted to, badly, but running felt like an admission I wasn't ready to make. So I walked, slow and deliberate, forcing myself to look normal in case anyone happened to glance out a window. The street looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Same quiet. Same parked cars. Same indifference. That almost broke me. I just lived through something that felt seismic, and the world hadn't shifted an inch to acknowledge it. I kept thinking about the person upstairs, probably standing in their hallway now, trying to decide if what they felt was real or just imagination. By the time I reached my own place, my legs felt hollow. I locked the door behind me again, another detail that still bothers me, and leaned against it, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. I hadn't taken anything. I hadn't been seen. But I didn't feel like I'd escaped. I felt like I'd been given a warning I wasn't sure I deserved. The adrenaline didn't fade the way I expected. There was no clean drop-off, no relief. It just curdled into something heavy and sour that sat in my chest all night. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that spill of light on the wall, stopping just short of me. I kept replaying it, wondering how close I'd actually been to being discovered, how different things could have gone with the smallest change in timing. I tried to justify it to myself, the same way I always did back then. Nothing really happened. No one got hurt. You left. But those thoughts felt flimsy now, like excuses written in pencil after something permanent had already been carved in stone. The truth was, I'd felt their presence upstairs, their confusion, their unease, and I'd caused it. Even if they never knew why their house felt wrong that night, I did. What surprised me most was the fear that lingered. Not fear of getting caught later, but fear of myself. I'd crossed a line I'd only ever imagined from a distance, and it had been easier to cross than I wanted to admit. That realization scared me more than any siren ever could. If I could talk myself into that once, what else could I justify given the right mood, the right night, the right excuse? By morning, I felt wrung out and hollow, like I'd aged years in a few hours. I went through my day on autopilot, nodding at people, answering questions, pretending I was still the same person I'd been before I walked out my door the night before. But something had shifted. I could feel it, even if I didn't yet have the words for what it meant. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. No police. No awkward conversations. No neighborhood warnings taped to mailboxes. On the outside, it was like the night never existed. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made everything heavier. Getting away with it didn't feel like a victory, it felt like being trusted with a secret I didn't deserve to keep. Every time I saw that neighbor after, my stomach tightened. We'd pass each other in the driveway or at the curb, exchange the same polite nods as before. They looked normal. Unharmed. And that somehow made it worse. There was no visible consequence to balance the scale, no external punishment to match what I felt inside. Just me, carrying the knowledge of what I'd done while they went on with their life, unaware. I started noticing how often people rely on the assumption of safety. Doors left unlocked for a minute. Curtains left open. Casual routines built on trust that no one is watching too closely. I'd never really seen that before, or if I had, I hadn't respected it. Now it felt fragile, like glass, clear, invisible, and easily shattered by someone who decides their wants matter more. The scariest part was realizing how easy it would be to do it again. That thought didn't come with excitement anymore, it came with dread. Because the barrier I'd imagined, this big moral wall, had turned out to be more like a thin curtain. And once you step through something like that, you can't pretend it was ever solid to begin with. I told myself that night was an anomaly, a glitch in my moral system that I could patch over if I just behaved better going forward. I threw myself into routines, work, errands, anything predictable. I avoided being out late. I avoided looking at houses the way I used to. On the surface, it probably looked like I was getting my life together. Internally, though, I was wrestling with a version of myself I didn't know how to erase. I'd always believed that people like that, people who break into homes, were fundamentally different from me. Now I knew how thin that distinction really was. It wasn't about being evil or broken. It was about a series of small permissions you give yourself, each one easier than the last. I caught myself overcorrecting in weird ways. Holding doors open longer than necessary. Apologizing too much. Going out of my way to be seen as harmless. None of it fixed the core issue, which was that I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. I'd proven to myself that under the right circumstances, I could rationalize almost anything. That loss of self-trust was brutal. It's hard to explain how destabilizing it is to realize you're capable of something you swore you never would be. Not because you were forced, but because you chose to. I wasn't proud of stopping. I was shaken by how close I'd come to not stopping at all. Even now, years later, that night follows me around in quiet ways. Not as a dramatic horror story, but as a low-level hum of awareness. When I lock my door, I think about why. When I hear a noise in the night, I understand how quickly your mind jumps from logic to fear. I know, firsthand, how vulnerable, safe, really is. I didn't confess to anyone back then. I didn't turn myself in. I just carried it. Some people might see that as getting away with it, but it never felt clean. It felt unfinished. Like a sentence without punctuation. There's no closure when the only witness to your worst moment is yourself. That experience changed how I saw crime, not as a headline or a statistic, but as a ripple. One bad decision creating unease that spreads outward, even if no one can trace it back to you. I don't know if that neighbor ever figured out why their house felt wrong that night, or if they brushed it off and moved on. I hope they did. I hope it didn't stick with them the way it stuck with me. What stayed with me most was the realization that the scariest part wasn't the risk, or the thrill. It was how easy it was to become someone I never planned to be. That knowledge doesn't fade. It just waits quietly, reminding you to pay attention to the choices you make before they start making you. If there's a reason I'm writing this now, it's not to dramatize what I did or pretend it was deeper than it was. It's because I know how easy it is to talk yourself into crossing lines when you're convinced you're the exception. I wasn't some mastermind or hardened criminal. I was just a guy who let resentment and entitlement talk louder than his conscience, one rationalization at a time. What I learned, too late, is that the moment you start treating other people's lives like backdrops for your own problems, you're already in trouble. It doesn't matter if you get away with it. That's a shallow metric. The real cost shows up in how you see yourself afterward, how trust, yours and others, starts to feel fragile instead of solid. If anyone reading this is standing on the edge of a bad decision, telling themselves it's harmless or temporary or justified, here's the truth I wish someone had forced me to face: you don't control how it changes you. You don't get to pick which part of it sticks. Sometimes the thing you steal isn't an object, it's your own sense of who you are. I didn't walk away from that night feeling lucky. I walked away altered. And while I can undo it, I can say this plainly: no thrill, no curiosity, no anger is worth carrying that kind of weight afterward. Some doors, once opened, don't slam shut. They just stay there in your mind, waiting to remind you who you almost became, and how close you actually were.